Before we jump into today's chilling story, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us conjure even more spine-tingling content just for you. It started with the shadows, not the ones cast by sunlight or street lamps, but the ones that shouldn't exist. Sarah first noticed them in her kitchen on a dull October morning. As she reached for a mug from the cabinet, a shadow darted across the corner of her vision. She turned, heart thudding, but there was nothing there. Just her quiet kitchen, the hum of the fridge, and the faint drip of the faucet. Just tired, she muttered, chalking it up to too many late nights. Yet, as the days passed, the shadows became bolder. They lingered longer, moved more deliberately, and they always seemed to be watching. Her husband, Greg, dismissed her concerns. "It's probably a trick of the light," he said one evening, barely glancing up from his laptop. Sarah wanted to believe him, but deep down she knew better. These shadows weren't natural. They were something else entirely. The final straw came one night as Sarah lay in bed. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. She was drifting off when she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she thought it might be her imagination. "Sarah!" Her eyes snapped open. Greg was sound asleep beside her, his soft snores breaking the silence. She held her breath, listening. There it was again, clearer this time. "Sarah." Her heart raced as she turned her head toward the corner of the room. The shadow there seemed thicker, darker than the others. It pulsed faintly as if alive, and then it moved. Sarah screamed, shaking Greg awake. He bolted upright, disoriented. "What? What is it?" She pointed to the corner, her hand trembling. "The shadow! It moved! It spoke to me!" Greg flicked on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. The shadow was gone. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice firm but tinged with worry. "You're stressed. Maybe you should see someone." Sarah wanted to argue, to make him understand, but the words wouldn't come. She nodded numbly, her mind racing. She wasn't crazy. She knew what she'd seen, and she had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. Over the next week, the shadows grew more aggressive. They didn't just linger in the corners anymore. They slithered along the walls, stretched across the floors, and reached for her with inky tendrils. Sarah avoided being alone as much as possible, but even in the company of others, she felt their presence. They were always there, just out of sight, waiting. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, she stumbled across an old journal. It was leather-bound, the edges worn with age. Intrigued, she opened it and began to read. The entries were dated from the 1940s and written in a neat, looping script. The author, a woman named Margaret, had lived in the house decades earlier. Her words were mundane at first, detailing daily chores and family life. But as Sarah read on, the entries took a darker turn. October 13th, 1947. "The shadows have returned. I'd hoped they were gone for good, but I was foolish to think they'd ever truly leave. They whisper to me at night, their voices like the rustling of dead leaves. I don't know how much longer I can endure this." October 19th, 1947. "They took Henry, my sweet boy, gone in an instant. One moment he was playing in the yard, and the next, he was gone. The shadows swallowed him whole. I can still hear him crying out for me. God help us all." Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the journal. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She needed answers, and she needed them now. That night, as Greg slept beside her, Sarah crept downstairs with the journal. She placed it on the kitchen table and opened her laptop, determined to uncover the truth about Margaret and the house. Her search yielded little at first. The house had changed owners several times over the years, but there was no record of anything unusual. No tragedies, no unexplained disappearances. It was as if Margaret's torment had been erased from history. Frustrated, Sarah returned to the journal. Flipping to the final pages, she found an entry that made her blood run cold. November 1st, 1947. There is a way to banish them, but it comes at a cost. The shadows feed on fear and despair. To weaken them, I must offer them something else, a part of myself, my essence. It's the only way to save what's left of my family. The entry ended abruptly, the ink smudged as if Margaret's hand had trembled while writing. Sarah closed the journal and stared into the darkness beyond the kitchen window. The shadows were there, waiting. She could feel their hunger, and for the first time she felt a flicker of resolve. She wouldn't let them take her family, no matter the cost. When darkness falls, secrets come alive, and the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur. By the time Mallory returned to her home, the sensation of being watched had taken root deep in her mind. She bolted the door behind her, peering through the peephole as if to confirm no shadowy figures followed. The night stretched on, heavy with silence. Yet, within the quiet, a faint sound echoed, the soft murmur of whispers coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Mallory tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the stress of the move and her vivid imagination had concocted the unnerving ambience. She decided to take refuge in research, pulling out her laptop to investigate the history of the peculiar town. Her fingers danced across the keyboard as she typed Mortwell Town History. What she uncovered left her cold. The articles were sparse, and most seemed to deliberately avoid detailing anything beyond mundane facts. Mortwell was a settlement founded in the late 1800s by miners, who had abandoned it years later when the mine inexplicably collapsed. A few vague mentions of tragic disappearances and whispers of curses floated in old reports. What stood out the most, however, was a local legend called the Shadow Veil. Mallory's curiosity deepened as she clicked on one of the older, more obscure links. It led to a scanned copy of a handwritten journal, a fragmentary diary from one of Mortwell's early settlers. They warned us when we came here. Never speak the name of the lost ones aloud. Never tread near the hollow oak after dark, for it stands as a gate. I hear them at night, their voices a hymn of sorrow and rage. The shadows are not empty. They see us. They wait. Mallory shuddered, slamming the laptop shut. She tried to shake off the chill that crept into her bones, but the unease refused to let go. The mention of a hollow oak rang oddly familiar. Where had she seen one? Her mind raced back to the woods she passed earlier that day. A lone, gnarled oak tree had stood there, surrounded by barren earth. Unable to sleep, Mallory grabbed a flashlight and her coat. The pull of curiosity was irresistible, despite her better judgment. She told herself she just wanted to prove the legend was nonsense. Equipped with a sense of defiance and a faint sense of dread, she ventured outside. The night air colder than she expected. The forest loomed, its tangled branches clawing at the starless sky. Mallory's flashlight carved a narrow path through the oppressive darkness, but the beam felt weak against the shadows. Each step she took seemed louder than it should have been, her boots crunching against the brittle leaves. As she approached the area where the hollow oak had stood, an unnatural silence descended. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. Then she saw it. The tree, its massive trunk twisted and split down the center as though it had been struck by some celestial force. The hollow inside the oak seemed impossibly dark, as if it absorbed the light. Mallory hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but something glimmered faintly within the hollow, catching her eye. Against her better judgment, she moved closer. Her flashlight revealed what appeared to be an old pendant, dangling from a brittle chain hooked onto a splintered root inside the tree. The pendant was etched with unfamiliar symbols, their sharp, angular shapes seeming to shift slightly in the light. When she reached out to touch it, an icy wind whipped through the forest, nearly knocking her backward. Her flashlight flickered violently, plunging her into brief intervals of darkness. It was then she heard it, a low guttural growl emanating from the hollow tree. Her heart raced as the growl grew louder, morphing into an unsettling blend of a human wail and animalistic snarl. Shadows spilled from the tree like liquid smoke, writhing unnaturally. Mallory stumbled back, dropping her flashlight, which now barely illuminated the ground beneath her feet. She snatched the flashlight and ran, the air seeming to grow thicker with every step. A faint voice trailed after her, whispering her name with mocking familiarity. Mallory. When she finally burst out of the forest and into her yard, her legs gave out beneath her. She slammed the door shut behind her, her chest heaving as she locked every bolt and latch. But the air inside her home felt no safer. The shadows seemed to cling to her walls, rippling with movements just out of sight. The rest of the night passed in fractured silence, broken only by faint noises she could no longer tell were real or imagined. By morning, her resolve hardened. She needed answers about the pendant, the tree, and whatever haunted this town. She decided to pay a visit to the local antique shop, reasoning that if anyone knew anything about old, cursed objects, it would be someone who dealt with history. The shop was dimly lit and crammed with artifacts from different eras. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with sharp, piercing eyes. She glanced at Mallory's pale face and the pendant clutched in her hand. "Where did you get that?" the woman asked sharply, her voice trembling. Mallory explained about the tree, leaving out the more supernatural elements. The woman's expression darkened. "That's a ward," the woman said, almost in a whisper. "It's meant to keep something out, or in. You shouldn't have taken it." "What do you mean?" Mallory demanded, fear prickling her skin. The woman hesitated before continuing, her voice low. "They call it the Shadow Veil. It's not a legend. It's a barrier. That tree stands over a gate to something that doesn't belong in this world. If you've disturbed it, you need to return the pendant before it's too late." Mallory wanted to laugh, to brush it off as superstition, but the events of the previous night were burned into her mind. She tried to argue, but the woman cut her off. "If you don't return it," she said, her voice shaking, "it will come for you." The weight of the pendant in Mallory's hand seemed heavier now, and for the first time she felt the full gravity of her mistake. Her heart sank as the woman added, "You may have already let it out." That night, Mallory's dreams were invaded by the most vivid nightmares she had ever experienced. She stood in a desolate version of Mortwell, where the buildings crumbled and the sky bled red. A towering shadow followed her wherever she went, its shapeless form shifting as it drew closer. When she woke, the faint smell of charred wood lingered in her room, though she couldn't find a source. Worse still, the shadows in her home seemed more pronounced. They stretched unnaturally, moving without regard for the light sources. Desperation clawed at her mind. If the woman was right, and the pendant was the key to keeping the gate sealed, Mallory needed to act quickly. But as she prepared to leave, she realized something horrifying. The pendant was no longer where she had placed it. It was missing. Then a sound came from the hallway, a soft creak, as if someone or something was stepping closer. Mallory froze, her breath catching in her throat as the oppressive darkness of her heart. The air in the cavern seemed heavier, laden with whispers that tickled at the edge of Isaac's comprehension. The circle of jagged rocks ahead resembled the fangs of a giant beast, their tips casting eerie shadows on the cavern walls. Isaac's trembling flashlight revealed strange symbols etched into the rocks, pulsing faintly with a sickly green hue. Isaac's fingers brushed the small vial in his pocket, a concoction he'd found in the shaman's journal, labeled as a protection tonic. Desperate for any edge, he uncorked it and swallowed the bitter liquid. It burned his throat and filled his mouth with a taste like spoiled fruit. But an immediate clarity washed over him. The whispers around him transformed into disjointed words. Why? Return. Unwelcome. Isaac stepped closer to the rocks, drawn to the source of the pulsating light. Behind the circle was a stone altar, slick with what looked like centuries of dried blood. The dagger he'd retrieved from the cabin felt like a lead weight in his hand. Its ornate design now seemed to glow faintly, mirroring the symbols on the rocks. A chilling gust swept through the cavern, extinguishing his flashlight. Total darkness swallowed him, save for the faint glow of the dagger and the symbols. He could feel the air shift as though something massive was circling him unseen. Isaac steadied his breath and whispered to himself, "Focus, one step at a time." As he approached the altar, the ground beneath him trembled. From the darkness emerged a colossal figure, its form indistinct yet terrifying. It seemed to shift between a mass of shadows and a grotesque, hulking beast, with countless red eyes blinking in unison. The whispers grew louder, no longer fragmented. "You dare trespass. You seek answers that were buried for a reason." Isaac held up the dagger, its light piercing the oppressive gloom. "I want to end this. You've haunted my family for too long." The entity's laughter was a deep, guttural sound that made Isaac's knees buckle. "You cannot end what you do not understand. The pact was made. The blood price must be paid." Memories not his own flooded Isaac's mind. He saw his great-grandfather standing in this very spot, desperation etched into his face. He was pleading with the same entity, offering something, someone, in exchange for power. The realization struck Isaac like a blow. The pact had been sealed with human sacrifice, and the debt was never truly repaid. "I won't continue this cycle," Isaac said through gritted teeth. He drove the dagger into the altar, expecting the entity to recoil. Instead, the cavern shook violently, and the shadows seemed to solidify around him. "Foolish child," the entity hissed. "Do you think mere defiance will free you? The pact can only be broken with equal sacrifice." Isaac's mind raced. Equal sacrifice. He thought of the shaman's journal, its cryptic warnings about balance and penance. The shaman had written of a willing heart, one who offered themselves willingly to undo the sins of the past. The weight of the truth settled over Isaac. The only way to end the curse was to give his life. Tears streamed down his face as he grasped the dagger. If this is the only way, so be it. He positioned the dagger over his heart, but before he could plunge it, a piercing scream echoed through the cavern. It was Emily's voice. Isaac froze. "Emily?" The entity's laughter reverberated through the cavern. "Do you not see? She is already mine. You are too late." Panic surged through Isaac as he turned toward the sound. A faint, flickering image of Emily appeared, her face pale and her eyes empty. She reached out to him, her movements stiff and unnatural. "Help." "Me," she whispered, her voice broken. "I'm here. I'll save you," Isaac cried, rushing toward her. But as he reached out, her image dissolved into smoke, and the shadows closed in tighter. He realized the entity was toying with him, using his guilt and fear as weapons. Isaac gripped the dagger tighter, his resolve hardening. "You won't win. I'll break the pact, no matter what it takes." The symbols on the rocks flared brighter, and the entity roared in anger. Isaac thrust the dagger into the altar again, pouring every ounce of his will into the act. A blinding light erupted from the altar, and the cavern filled with a deafening roar. When the light faded, Isaac found himself back in the cabin, the dagger lying on the floor beside him. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. He staggered to his feet, his body aching but intact. "Did it work?" he muttered, looking around. The cabin's interior was unchanged, but something felt lighter. He stepped outside and saw the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. For the first time in days, the forest seemed alive, birds chirping and the wind rustling the trees gently. But a nagging doubt lingered in Isaac's mind. As he walked back toward his car, he glanced over his shoulder. The forest was still, too still, and though he could no longer hear the whispers, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Isaac climbed into his car and started the engine, eager to leave the cursed land behind. Yet as he drove away, a faint voice echoed in his mind. The debt is never truly repaid. And deep within the cavern, the faint green symbols began to pulse once more. Ohm began to move,